The wagon jolted violently as it hit another deep rut, sending Violet Summers tumbling against the wooden side with a painful thud. She'd been ill for days now, the fever burning through her thin frame as the wagon train continued its relentless journey westward across the unforgiving terrain of the Kansas Territory in 1867. "Can't keep stopping for her," she heard Mr. Benson mutter to the wagon master. "We're already behind schedule because of the rain last week." Violet tried to sit up, her parched lips cracking as she attempted to speak. The consumption that had taken her parents back in St. Louis was now working its way through her system, leaving her too weak to defend herself against the growing resentment of the other travelers. "Please," she whispered, "I'll be better soon." But her words were lost in the rumble of wagon wheels and the impatient voices of men who valued progress over compassion. That night, as the wagon train made camp along the Smoky Hill Trail, Violet overheard the decision that would change her life forever. "She's slowing us down," Mr. Benson said firmly to the others gathered around the campfire. "I say we leave her at the next settlement. If there's none, then we leave her anyway. Can't risk the whole train for one dying girl." Tears slipped silently down Violet's hollow cheeks as she lay in the back of the wagon, too weak to protest, too afraid to plead. She was 22 years old with nothing to her name but a small bundle of belongings and the gold locket containing a miniature portrait of her parents. The next morning dawned with a brilliant Kansas sunrise that Violet feared might be her last. The wagon lurched forward, beginning another day's journey. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her fever raging. When the wagon stopped around midday, she felt rough hands grabbing her. "Nothing personal, Miss Summers," Mr. Benson said without meeting her eyes. "But the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one." They left her under a lone cottonwood tree with her small bundle, a canteen of water, and a day's worth of food, a pitiful gesture of mercy that wouldn't sustain her for long. Violet watched through tear-blurred eyes as the wagon train continued westward, leaving her alone in the vast prairie wilderness. Hours passed. The sun began its descent, painting the endless sky with streaks of orange and purple. Violet's consciousness faded as dehydration and fever took their toll. Her last conscious thought was that at least she would die under an open sky rather than in the cramped confines of the wagon. The thundering of hooves stirred her from the edge of oblivion. Through half-lidded eyes, she saw a figure on horseback approaching, silhouetted against the setting sun. "My God!" a deep voice exclaimed. "What in tarnation?" Strong arms lifted her gently, cradling her against a broad chest that smelled of leather, tobacco, and the outdoors. "Don't you worry now, miss," the voice rumbled soothingly. "I've got you." As consciousness slipped away again, Violet felt herself being lifted onto a horse, held securely in a stranger's embrace as they began to move across the prairie. Miles O'Malley had been tracking a small herd of mustangs when he spotted what looked like a bundle of rags beneath a cottonwood tree. His curiosity had led him to discover not discarded clothing but a woman barely alive and burning with fever. "Hold on," he murmured as he urged his horse, Thunder, into a steady canter toward his homestead. "Just hold on." The young woman in his arms was light as a feather, her face gaunt and pale beneath the dirt and dried tears. Miles had seen plenty of hardship in his 30 years, the war between the states, the harsh realities of frontier life, but the deliberate abandonment of someone so vulnerable filled him with a cold rage. His homestead came into view just as the last light faded from the sky, a sturdy cabin with a small barn and corral set against a backdrop of rolling hills. Smoke curled from the chimney. His ranch hand, old Joe, would have started the evening fire. "Joe!" Miles called as he carefully dismounted, still cradling the unconscious woman. "Need help here." The weathered door of the cabin swung open, revealing a grizzled man in his 60s. Joe's eyes widened at the sight of the burden in his employer's arms. "Lord Almighty, What did you find out there? Joe hurried to hold the door wider. Someone left to die, Miles replied grimly, carrying Violet inside and laying her gently on his own bed. Fetch some water and clean linens. She's burning up with fever. Joe moved with surprising speed for a man his age, bringing the requested items while Miles removed his hat and coat. Should I ride for Doc Jenkins? Joe asked, hovering in the doorway. Miles felt the woman's forehead and checked her pulse. She's in a bad way, but I don't think she'd survive the wait. Doc's attending that birth over at the Peterson place, could be gone for days. He rolled up his sleeves. My ma was a healer, taught me enough to get by. We'll do what we can here. Through the night, Miles and Joe worked to break Violet's fever. They bathed her burning skin with cool water, spooned broth between her cracked lips, and administered the herbal remedies Miles's mother had taught him to prepare. By dawn, Miles was exhausted but determined. The young woman's breathing had eased slightly, but she remained unconscious, locked in the grip of whatever illness had led to her abandonment. You should rest, boss, Joe said, placing a cup of strong coffee at Miles's elbow. I can watch over her for a spell. Miles shook his head, his eyes never leaving Violet's face. I'll be fine. You go tend to the horses and get some sleep yourself. When Joe had gone, Miles leaned closer to the bed. I don't know who you are or what happened to you, he said softly, but you're safe now. I promise you that. As if in response to his words, Violet's eyelids fluttered, and for a brief moment, her fever-bright gaze met his before she slipped back into unconsciousness. For 3 days, Violet hovered between life and death while Miles maintained his vigil, leaving her side only when absolutely necessary. On the morning of the 4th day, her fever finally broke. Miles had dozed off in the chair beside the bed and awakened to find a pair of deep blue eyes studying him with confusion and fear. Where am I? She whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. Miles straightened, relief washing over him. You're safe, miss. You're at my ranch about 20 miles east of Fort Hays. I found you abandoned under a cottonwood tree 4 days ago. Violet's eyes filled with tears as memory returned. They left me, said I was too sick, slowing them down. Miles's jaw tightened in anger, but he kept his voice gentle. What's your name, miss? Violet, she replied. Violet Summers. I'm Miles O'Malley. This is my ranch. He poured a cup of water from the pitcher on the bedside table and helped her drink it slowly. You've been very ill, Miss Summers, but I think the worst has passed now. Violet's hand trembled as she touched the clean nightgown she was wearing. Did you? Miles's face reddened slightly. Mrs. Peterson from the neighboring homestead came by yesterday. She helped tend to your needs. I kept my distance when propriety demanded it. Relief and gratitude softened Violet's expression. Thank you, Mr. O'Malley. I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness. No need for repayment. Just focus on getting well. Miles stood, suddenly aware of his rumpled appearance and several days' worth of stubble. I'll bring you some broth. You need to build your strength. As Miles headed to the kitchen, he found himself unusually affected by the young woman's presence. Something about her vulnerability combined with the quiet dignity in her eyes stirred feelings he had long suppressed. Shaking off such thoughts as inappropriate, he set about preparing a simple meal for his unexpected guest. In the following days, Violet's strength gradually returned. Miles learned that she had been traveling with the Benson family's wagon train, heading for Oregon after losing her parents to consumption in St. Louis. She had begun showing symptoms of the same illness shortly after the journey began. The doctor in St. Louis said I didn't have the consumption. Violet explained one evening as she sat wrapped in a blanket by the fire, well enough now to leave the bed for short periods. He thought it was just exhaustion and grief making me weak. I believed him because I wanted to. Miles, seated across from her, nodded in understanding. Sometimes hope makes fools of the wisest among us. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't found me, Violet said softly, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. I owe you my life, Mr. O'Malley. Miles, he corrected gently. And you don't owe me anything, Miss Summers. Violet, she replied with a small smile. And I disagree. I owe you everything. Their gazes held for a moment longer than necessary before Miles cleared his throat and stood. You should rest. You're still recovering. As the days passed and Violet's health improved, she began to help around the cabin, insisting that she earn her keep. Despite Miles's protests that she should continue resting, she took over the cooking and mending, showing surprising skill with both. Where did you learn to cook like this? Miles asked one evening as he savored a stew that put his own culinary efforts to shame. Violet's smile held a touch of sadness. My mother taught me. She said a woman should know how to make a home comfortable, no matter the circumstances. Joe, who had been skeptical of their guest at first, had become Violet's staunch defender. The girl needs to stay, he told Miles bluntly one morning as they mended fences far from the cabin. She's good for the place. Good for you too, if you'd admit it. Miles frowned at his ranch hand. She'll want to continue her journey once she's fully recovered. I won't hold her here against her will. Joe snorted. Might be she doesn't want to leave. Have you asked her? The truth was, Miles hadn't broached the subject of Violet's future plans. Part of him feared her answer, whether it was to stay or go. The feelings developing within him were complicated and increasingly difficult to ignore. That evening, as Violet hung freshly washed laundry to dry near the cabin, Miles found himself watching her from the corral. The setting sun caught in her auburn hair, creating a halo effect that made his breath catch. She had filled out slightly in the weeks since her arrival, her face no longer gaunt with illness but softly rounded, her eyes bright with returning health. You're staring, boss, Joe commented as he passed by with an armload of hay. Miles turned away, embarrassed at being caught. Just checking that she's not overexerting herself. Sure, Joe replied with a knowing grin. That's what it is. Later that night, after Joe had retired to his small room off the barn, Miles and Violet sat in companionable silence before the fire. Outside, a spring storm had blown in, rain pattering against the roof and windows. I received a letter from Fort Hays today, Miles said finally, breaking the silence. Apparently, there's word of a wagon train coming through next month, heading for Oregon. Violet's hands stilled on the shirt she was mending. I see. I thought you might want to know, in case you wanted to continue your journey. The words felt like stones in Miles's mouth. Violet was quiet for so long that Miles feared he had offended her. Finally, she set aside her mending and looked directly at him. Is that what you want, Miles? For me to join the wagon train? The question caught him off guard. I want whatever makes you happy, he answered carefully. That's not an answer, she said softly. Do you want me to leave? Miles met her gaze, finding himself unable to maintain the polite fiction any longer. No, he admitted. I don't want you to leave, but I have no right to ask you to stay. Violet's expression softened. Perhaps I'm waiting to be asked. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken feelings. Miles set aside his pipe and moved to kneel before her chair, taking her small hands in his larger ones. Stay, Violet, he said simply. Not because you feel indebted or because you have nowhere else to go. Stay because I've come to care for you more than I thought possible. Stay because this place has felt more like a home since you arrived than it ever did before. Tears shimmered in Violet's eyes. I've never belonged anywhere the way I feel I belong here. With you. Miles raised a hand to gently brush a tear from her cheek. Then stay. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question asked and answered in the most ancient language of all. When they parted, Miles rested his forehead against hers, overwhelmed by the feelings coursing through him. I should speak to Reverend Thomas in town, he murmured. Do things properly. Violet smiled, her face alight with happiness. Yes, you should. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Miles rode into Fort Hays to speak with Reverend Thomas about performing a wedding ceremony. Word spread quickly about the upcoming nuptials between the reclusive rancher and the mysterious young woman he had rescued from certain death on the prairie. Mrs. Peterson and the other women from neighboring homesteads took Violet under their wing, helping her prepare for the wedding and offering advice about married life on the frontier. They were charmed by her gentle nature and impressed by her resilience. That girl's stronger than she looks, Mrs. Peterson informed Miles during one of her visits. Survived being tossed away like yesterday's garbage, fought off a fever that would have killed most, and still has kindness in her heart. You're a lucky man, Miles O'Malley. Miles knew this to be true. Each day revealed new aspects of Violet's character that only deepened his admiration and love for her. Despite her Eastern upbringing, she adapted quickly to ranch life, learning to ride, helping with the livestock, and transforming the simple cabin into a true home with small, thoughtful touches. Their wedding day dawned clear and bright in early June. Neighbors from miles around gathered at the small church in Fort Hays to witness the union. Violet wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Peterson had helped her make, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a formal veil. As Miles watched her walk toward him down the church's narrow aisle, he was struck by how far they had both come from that fateful evening when he'd found her half dead beneath the cottonwood tree. Life on the frontier had taught him that beauty often emerged from the harshest circumstances, but never had that lesson been more personally meaningful than in this moment. Dearly beloved, Reverend Thomas began, his voice carrying through the packed church. We are gathered here today in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. When Miles slipped a simple gold band onto Violet's finger purchased with money from his spring cattle sale, he felt a sense of rightness that transcended words. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Reverend Thomas declared with a broad smile. Mr. O'Malley, you may kiss your bride. The kiss they shared was both a promise and a thanksgiving for second chances, for unexpected rescues, for love found in the most unlikely circumstances. The celebration continued at the O'Malley Ranch, where tables groaned under the weight of food brought by every family in attendance. Children played in the yard, men discussed cattle prices and weather forecasts, and women exchanged recipes and news. Through it all, Miles kept Violet's hand firmly in his, as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ranch yard, the guests gradually departed, leaving the newlyweds to begin their life together in privacy. Are you happy, Mrs. O'Malley? Miles asked as they stood on the porch, watching the last wagon disappear over the hill. Violet leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. Happier than I ever thought possible. It's strange to think that the worst day of my life led me to the best. Miles wrapped his arm around her waist. Life has a way of balancing itself, I suppose. Later that night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Violet traced the outline of Miles's face with gentle fingers. I was so afraid, she confessed, not just of dying alone on the prairie, but of living without purpose, without love. I felt so useless when they cast me aside. Miles caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. You could never be useless, Violet. You've brought light and purpose back into my life. After the war, I came out here to escape, to hide from the memories. I was existing, not living. You changed that. "We saved each other then?" she whispered. "I reckon we did," he agreed, pulling her closer. As summer turned to autumn, Violet and Miles settled into the rhythms of married life on the frontier. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Miles's knowledge of cattle and horses, complemented by Violet's careful management of their household resources. Even old Joe seemed rejuvenated by the changes, taking a special pride in teaching Violet the ways of frontier living. "You're catching on quick for a city girl," he told her one afternoon as he showed her how to preserve vegetables from their garden for the coming winter. "Most Easterners take years to adapt, if they ever do." Violet smiled at the compliment. "I have good teachers, and plenty of motivation to learn." The motivation she spoke of became even more apparent in late October when she shared the news with Miles that they were expecting a child in the spring. His reaction, stunned silence followed by whoops of joy that scared the chickens, became a story she would tell for years to come. "A baby?" he marveled that night, his hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. "Our baby." Violet covered his hand with hers. "I never dared dream of this much happiness." The winter of 1867-1868 proved to be harsh, with blizzards sweeping across the Kansas plains and temperatures dropping to dangerous lows. Miles worried constantly about Violet's health, remembering her frail condition when he'd found her. But pregnancy seemed to have strengthened rather than weakened her. She glowed with health and purpose, preparing for the baby's arrival with the same determination she brought to everything. "You're hovering again," she chided Miles gently one January afternoon as he insisted on bringing in the firewood himself despite her offers to help. "I'm with child, not made of glass." "Humor me," he replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Let me take care of you." As Violet's pregnancy progressed, they transformed a corner of their bedroom into a nursery space, with Miles crafting a cradle from oak and Violet sewing tiny garments in the evenings by the fire. They debated names, discussed hopes for their child's future, and marveled at the miracle growing between them. "Do you ever think about them?" Miles asked one night as they lay together, his hand resting on the prominent swell of her belly. "The people who left you behind?" Violet was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes. Not with anger anymore, though. In a strange way, I'm grateful. If they hadn't abandoned me, I wouldn't be here with you. I wouldn't be about to become a mother." Miles tightened his arm around her. "You're a remarkable woman, Violet O'Malley. And you're a good man, Miles O'Malley. Our child is fortunate to have you for a father." In May of 1868, after a long labor that tested both Violet's strength and Miles's nerves, their daughter Victoria entered the world with a lusty cry that belied her small size. "She has your spirit," Mrs. Peterson declared as she placed the swaddled infant in Violet's arms. "Strong-willed from the start." Miles, allowed into the bedroom at last, approached the bed with uncharacteristic timidity. The sight of Violet holding their daughter, both of them tired but radiant, struck him with a force that momentarily robbed him of speech. "Come meet your daughter," Violet said softly. "Victoria Rose O'Malley." Miles sat carefully on the edge of the bed and gazed in wonder at the tiny face peering up at him from the bundle of blankets. Victoria had a dusting of dark hair and eyes that already seemed to hold the deep blue of her mother's. "She's perfect," he whispered, gently touching a fingertip to his daughter's miniature hand. Victoria responded by grasping his finger with surprising strength, as if making a claim on his heart that he was all too willing to surrender. "I thought we might call her Tori," Violet suggested. "For everyday use." Miles nodded, unable to tear his gaze away from the miracle of his daughter. "Tori. It suits her." Life with a newborn brought new challenges and joys to the O'Malley household. Tori proved to be a generally content baby, but she had definite opinions about when she wanted attention and was not shy about expressing them. Miles discovered a talent for soothing her that sometimes surpassed even Violet's, pacing the floor with Tori against his shoulder in the small hours of the night, singing old Irish ballads his mother had taught him. "You're spoiling her," Joe grumbled good-naturedly as he watched Miles rock Tori one afternoon. "Going to grow up thinking the world revolves around her. Doesn't it?" Miles replied with a grin, his weathered face softening as he gazed down at his daughter. As summer progressed, so did the prosperity of the O'Malley ranch. The spring calving had been successful, with minimal losses despite the harsh winter. Miles's reputation for breeding quality horses was spreading, bringing buyers from as far away as Topeka. With the additional income, he was able to hire 2 more hands to help with the expanding operation, allowing him to spend more time with Violet and Tori. In August, an unexpected visitor arrived at the ranch. Miles was working with a young colt in the corral when he spotted a wagon approaching. Shading his eyes against the sun, he recognized the Fort Hays merchant who occasionally delivered supplies to outlying ranches. "Mr. O'Malley," the merchant called as he drew closer. "Got someone here asking after your wife." Miles's hand instinctively moved to the pistol on his hip as a man climbed down from the wagon. The stranger was well-dressed but travel-worn, with a nervous expression that increased when he saw Miles's defensive posture. "I mean no harm, sir," the man said quickly, removing his hat. "My name is William Benson. I'm looking for a Miss Violet Summers. I was told in town that she might be here, that she's now Mrs. O'Malley." Miles's jaw tightened. "Benson? Any relation to the Bensons who left my wife to die on the prairie last year?" William's face paled. "My father and mother led that wagon train. I was away at school when they departed for Oregon. When I joined them there months later, my sister told me what they had done. I've come to make amends, if possible." Miles studied the man carefully, looking for any sign of deception. Finding none, he called to Joe to take over with the colt. "Wait here," he instructed William. "I'll speak to my wife." Inside the cabin, Violet was placing freshly baked bread on the table, Tori sleeping peacefully in a basket nearby. The domestic scene so normal now but once so far beyond his hopes made Miles pause in the doorway. "We have a visitor," he said when Violet looked up with a questioning smile. "William Benson. Says he's the son of the people who abandoned you. Wants to make amends." Violet's hands stilled on the loaf of bread. "Benson? I didn't know they had a son my age. There were younger children with them, but—" She glanced at Tori. "What does he want?" "To apologize, he says. I can send him away." Violet considered this, then shook her head. "No. I'd like to hear what he has to say." When William Benson was shown into the cabin, his eyes immediately went to Violet. "Miss Summers, the first mean Mrs. O'Malley. You're alive. Thank God." "No thanks to your family," Miles said coldly, positioning himself protectively beside his wife. William nodded, accepting the rebuke. "You're right, sir. What my parents did was unforgivable. When my sister told me, I could scarcely believe it. I've spent months trying to find out what became of you, fearing the worst." "Why?" Violet asked simply. "Why go to such trouble for a stranger?" William's expression was pained. "Because my parents raised me to believe that we have a responsibility to each other. What they did to you violated everything they taught me. I couldn't reconcile it. I had to know, and if possible, try to make it right." Violet gestured for him to sit at the table. "Your parents were afraid. The journey was difficult, and they had children to consider." "That's no excuse for leaving someone to die," William insisted. "My sister Emma said she begged them to reconsider, but my father was adamant." "How are they now?" Violet asked, her natural compassion asserting itself despite everything. William's expression grew somber. "My father passed away last winter. Pneumonia. My mother is managing with my help, but she's never been the same." I think the guilt weighs on her. I'm sorry for your loss, Violet said softly. Miles watched the exchange with mixed emotions. His wife's capacity for forgiveness never ceased to amaze him, but he wasn't sure he could be so generous. If William's parents had succeeded in their abandonment, Miles would never have known Violet, never have held his daughter in his arms. I've brought something, William said, reaching into his coat pocket. When Emma told me what happened, she gave me this. Said it was yours and that our mother took it from your belongings before they left you. He held out a small velvet pouch. Violet took it with trembling hands and opened it to find her gold locket, the one containing the miniature portraits of her parents that she had believed lost forever. I thought it was gone, she whispered, tears filling her eyes as she opened the locket to reveal the familiar faces. Thank you for returning it. Tori chose that moment to wake, her small cries drawing everyone's attention. Violet rose to lift her daughter from the basket, cradling her close. Your child? William asked, his expression softening at the sight of the baby. Our daughter, Victoria, Miles answered, some of the hostility leaving his voice as he gazed at his family. William smiled sadly. It seems fate had better plans for you than Oregon, Mrs. O'Malley. Yes, Violet agreed, looking from Tori to Miles with a love that made her eyes shine. Much better plans. After William departed, having extended an invitation for the O'Malleys to visit, should they ever travel to Oregon, Violet stood on the porch with Miles, watching the wagon disappear into the distance. Are you all right? Miles asked, slipping an arm around her waist. Violet nodded, the locket now hanging around her neck where it belonged. I am. Better than all right. His visit has closed a chapter one didn't realize was still open. You forgave them very easily, Miles observed, not critically but with wonder. Not easily, Violet corrected, but necessarily. Holding on to bitterness would only poison the happiness we found. She turned in his arms to face him. And we are happy, aren't we? Miles pulled her closer, mindful of Tori sleeping against her shoulder. Happier than I ever thought possible. That night, as they lay in bed with Tori sleeping peacefully in her cradle nearby, Violet nestled against Miles's side, her head on his chest. When William appeared today, for just a moment I was afraid, she admitted quietly. Afraid he'd come to take me away somehow, to disrupt everything we've built. Miles tightened his arm around her. Nothing and no one will ever take you from me. Not while I draw breath. Violet smiled in the darkness. Such fierce protectiveness from the man who once found me half dead under a tree. That day changed everything, Miles murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. I rode out looking for mustangs and instead found the other half of my soul. Poetic for a cowboy, Violet teased gently. You inspire poetry, Mrs. O'Malley. Among other things. Their lips met in a kiss that conveyed all the love, gratitude, and passion that had grown between them over the past year. When they finally parted, Violet laid her head back on Miles's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. I love you, Miles O'Malley, she whispered. For finding me, for saving me, for giving me a home and a family. And I love you, Violet O'Malley, he replied, his voice husky with emotion. For bringing light and purpose back into my life. Outside their window, the Kansas prairie stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars, the same vista that had once seemed so threatening to Violet, now a familiar and beloved landscape. The frontier that had nearly claimed her life had instead given her a new one, richer and fuller than she could have imagined. The years passed, bringing changes both expected and surprising to the O'Malley ranch. Tori grew from a determined infant into an equally determined little girl, with her mother's blue eyes and her father's adventurous spirit. She was joined by a brother, Matthew, in 1870, and twin sisters, Sarah and Elizabeth, In 1873, the O'Malley family expanded along with their ranch, which had become one of the most prosperous in the region. Miles's breeding program for both cattle and horses had proven remarkably successful, allowing them to build a larger home to accommodate their growing family. The original cabin remained standing, converted into a bunkhouse for the ranch hands. Old Joe, though officially retired, still supervised the younger men with crusty authority, taking particular pride in teaching the O'Malley children about ranch life. Violet, once thought too weak to survive the journey west, had become known throughout the region for her strength and capabilities. She managed the household with quiet efficiency, helped with the ranch accounts, and still found time to serve on the local school board once Tori reached school age. The consumption that had threatened her life had never returned, leading Doc Jenkins to speculate that it had been bronchitis all along, exacerbated by grief and the harsh conditions of wagon travel. "You're a living testament to the healing power of love and clean Kansas air," the doctor joked during one of his visits to check on a pregnant Elizabeth O'Malley in 1890. By then, Violet and Miles had become grandparents. Tori had married the son of a neighboring rancher and given birth to a daughter they named Violet in honor of her grandmother. Young Matthew was engaged to the schoolteacher who had come to Fort Hays from Boston 3 years earlier, while the twins were being courted by respectable young men from town. "Did you ever imagine this?" Violet asked Miles one evening as they sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the prairie in gold and crimson. At 45, her auburn hair was threaded with silver, and fine lines marked the corners of her eyes. But to Miles, she was more beautiful than ever. "Not in my wildest dreams," he admitted, reaching over to take her hand. At 53, he had aged well, still strong and vital despite the gray in his hair and beard. "When I found you under that cottonwood tree, I was just hoping you'd survive the night." Violet squeezed his hand, remembering those early days with the clarity that important memories retain even after decades. "You gave me more than survival, Miles. You gave me a life worth living." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Tori and her husband, bringing little Violet for a visit. The toddler broke free from her mother's grasp and ran straight for her grandfather, who scooped her up with practiced ease. "There's my prairie flower," he said, settling the giggling child on his knee. "Have you been a good girl for your mama?" "She's been a terror," Tori said with fond exasperation, leaning down to kiss her mother's cheek. "Every bit as stubborn as her namesake, according to Pa." "I'll take that as a compliment," Violet replied with a smile. "Stubbornness has its virtues on the frontier." "That it does," Miles agreed, bouncing his granddaughter gently. "Without it, none of us would be here now." Later that night, after their family had departed and the house was quiet once more, Miles found Violet standing by the window in their bedroom, looking out at the star-filled sky. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" he asked, coming to stand behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "About journeys," she replied, leaning back against him. "About how the worst day of my life led to everything good that followed. About how being thrown away like something worthless brought me to someone who treasured me." Miles turned her gently to face him. "I've treasured every moment with you, Violet. Every day since I found you has been a gift I never expected to receive. Even when I was delirious with fever and probably talking nonsense," she teased. "Even then," he assured her, "there was something about you from the very beginning that called to me, as if my heart recognized yours before my head caught up." Violet reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the familiar contours with tenderness. "For a man of few words, you certainly know how to use them when it matters." "Only with you," he murmured, lowering his head to kiss her with the same devotion that had characterized their marriage for over 2 decades. In 1893, on the 25th anniversary of their wedding, the O'Malleys hosted a celebration that brought together friends, neighbors, and their now extensive family. The ranch was at its finest, with flowers from Violet's garden decorating every available surface and tables laden with food prepared by the O'Malley women working together. Reverend Thomas, now elderly but still serving the community, proposed a toast to the couple whose love story had become something of a legend in the region. "To Miles and Violet," he said, raising his glass, "whose union reminds us that even in our darkest moments, hope and love may be just around the corner. May your next 25 years together be as blessed as the first." The gathering cheered, glasses raised high. Miles, never comfortable being the center of attention, nevertheless stood proudly beside his wife, her hand clasped firmly in his. "Should I tell them the secret to a happy marriage?" he whispered to Violet with a twinkle in his eye. "And what would that be, Mr. O'Malley?" she asked, playing along. "Finding a woman too stubborn to die and too loving to hold a grudge," he replied softly, so only she could hear. Violet laughed, the sound as musical to Miles's ears as it had been when he first heard it. "I think we'll keep that between ourselves." As the celebration continued around them, Miles found himself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. From that desperate rescue on the prairie to this day of joy and abundance, their life together had been built on a foundation of love that had never wavered, despite the challenges of frontier life. The Kansas territory they had known had become the state of Kansas. Fort Hays had grown from a military outpost into a proper town. Their children had grown into adults with families of their own. Through it all, Miles and Violet had remained constants for each other, partners in every sense of the word. "Dance with me?" Violet said suddenly, pulling Miles from his reverie as the fiddlers struck up a waltz. "Here? Now?" he asked, though he was already allowing her to lead him toward the area cleared for dancing. "Yes, here and now," she insisted, "while we're still young enough to enjoy it." Miles laughed at that. They were hardly young anymore, but he took her in his arms willingly, moving with the grace that had surprised her when they'd first danced together at their wedding. "You're still the most beautiful woman I've ever seen," he told her as they circled among the other dancers, many of them their own descendants. "And you're still the most gallant rescuer a girl could hope for," she replied, her eyes shining with love and memories. As the sun set on their anniversary celebration, casting long shadows across the land they had tamed together, Miles and Violet stood once more on the porch of their home, arms around each other as they watched their family dispersing to their own homes or to the guest rooms prepared for them. "We've been blessed," Violet said softly, "beyond anything I could have imagined that day when Mr. Benson left me under the cottonwood tree." Miles tightened his arm around her shoulders. "We've earned our happiness, I think, through hard work and faith in each other. And love," Violet added. "Always love. Always." Miles agreed, bending to kiss her with the tenderness of a man who knew exactly how precious was the gift he had been given. "From the moment I found you until my last breath, Violet O'Malley. Always love." In the years that followed, the O'Malley Ranch continued to thrive under the management of Matthew and his wife, with Miles and Violet taking on increasingly advisory roles. They traveled occasionally to visit Tori and her growing family in Colorado, to see the twins who had both married merchants in Kansas City, and once, memorably, all the way to New York City to attend the wedding of a grandchild. "I never thought I'd see the Atlantic Ocean," Violet marveled as they stood on the shoreline during that journey east. "From abandoned on the prairie to standing by the sea, life takes unexpected turns." "That it does," Miles agreed, holding her close against the ocean breeze. "But I wouldn't change a single one of ours." When Miles passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1910 at the age of 73, Violet felt as though half of her heart had departed with him. Yet the love they had built surrounded her in the form of their children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. Their legacy lived on in the ranch that bore their name, in the community they had helped to build, and in the story of their love that continued to inspire new generations. On warm summer evenings, Violet would often sit on the porch of the home Miles had built for her, watching the sunset paint the Kansas sky in colors no artist could capture. In those quiet moments, she could almost feel him beside her again, his strong presence a comfort even in absence. "You were right, my love," she would whisper to the prairie wind. "The worst day of my life led to the best, and being thrown away brought me home." Violet lived to see her 90th birthday, surrounded by 4 generations of O'Malleys who had gathered to celebrate the matriarch whose strength and love had founded their family. When she finally joined Miles in 1936, she was laid to rest beside him in the small family cemetery on a hill overlooking the ranch. Their headstones, simple but dignified, stood side by side, engraved with their names, dates, and a single line that told the essence of their extraordinary love story. Found each other on the prairie, built a life on love. The cottonwood tree that had once sheltered a dying Violet had long since fallen, but its descendants grew tall around the O'Malley homestead, their leaves whispering in the Kansas wind like voices from the past, telling and retelling the story of a woman thrown off a wagon for being too weak, and the cowboy who picked her up and carried her home to life, to love, and to a legacy that would endure for generations to come.